Truth lies beneath the comfortable narratives we tell ourselves. History echoes, patterns repeat. There is nothing new under the sun. When biblical truth confronts modern choices, we face uncomfortable parallels. What remains hidden in plain sight? What connections have we refused to see? Some silences protect what should be exposed. Some boundaries protect what should be cherished. Today, another silence breaks. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shattering the Silence, where we give voice to untold stories. I am your host, Monica, and I am grateful that you've decided to join me today. You know, it has been a challenging week. Wasn't anything I couldn't handle, but I did know that once I decided to discuss this topic, that things weren't going to always go well. It is something about certain areas, namely abortion in this case, where the enemy just seems to get upset when you begin to discuss certain topics such as this. But as I stated, I will continue to persevere. I will continue to get through these topics. I won't say that this topic in particular hasn't had some kind of weight on me. Not because I'm not healed from anything, but because a topic such as this nature, the intentional killing of unborn babies, humans, it just has a weight of its own when you consider what that means. And so this week, I will say, as I was, preparing for these next couple of episodes, I was listening to some interviews, some podcasts as well, some interviews. And I could say this, listening to the number of interviews I did relating to the pro-choice and the pro-life debate, it has made me even that much more 100% pro-life. And I say that because as I listened to the arguments, and I made sure I wanted to really, really listen to the arguments, those that are on the pro-choice side of things, what they were saying, was there something that I wasn't considering? Because it's easy to always go out and research something and find people that are on your side. But to be fair and to balance the conversation, I wanted to also listen to those on the pro-choice side to see if there was anything different that I didn't consider. And I can wholeheartedly say that some of the themes, even though the interviews were with different people, some of the themes are exactly the same. And one of the things that I've noticed is that because some of the interviews were actually debates between the pro-life and the pro-choice movement. And when I was watching the debates and listening to the debates, one of the things I noticed that it appeared that when the person on the pro-choice side felt that they were not winning, air quotes, this debate, they often went to, well, what about rape? Or what about the mother whose life is at risk? And they go to those extremes. And in next week's episode, I plan to pull out some statistics about those two very things to see, in the whole scheme of things, what are the true percentages as it relates to those. But I just wanted to let you know, I thank you for those who said that they were praying for me as I get through this. As you see, this is another audio only episode, which is okay. It's okay. And I do plan to go back to video, but this is okay. And I will continue to do this until I'm able to get my video where it needs to be. So, what are we going to talk about today? Well, last week we looked at Adam and Eve and how their immediate response to sin was to cover their nakedness. So that moment when shame entered the human experience, I shared with you that I often wondered why they covered their nakedness. Why was that the first thing? I also shared my personal journey from being pro-choice and having an abortion to becoming unequivocally pro-life. And today we're just going to go deeper into history, biblical history, to uncover something that might make you, it may make you cringe a little bit, because we're going to talk about that ancient practice that we read about in the Bible, child sacrifice to Molech, and how disturbingly so, actually, it parallels to abortion in our society. So this is like modern day Molech. So if I was to ask you all, do you have any idols in your life? I'm sure a lot of you would say, no, I don't have any idols. But what about the idol of self? So think about that for a minute. What about the idol of self? And, some of you may say, well, I'm supposed to take care of myself, and I'm supposed to, make sure I have self-care. And you absolutely are supposed to take care of yourself, and there's nothing wrong with self-care. But some of us have made ourselves an idol. And hopefully throughout this episode and the next episode, you will see exactly what I'm getting at when I say that. So one of the questions I want to start off with is, why do we sacrifice our children? I know some of you moms may say, I'm not sacrificing my children. But hear me out. Stay with me a little bit. Throughout human history and across very different cultures, there's been this pattern of sacrificing the most vulnerable among us, and that is our children. In ancient times, so in biblical times, this sacrifice was often explicit and ritualistic. So the Canaanites and other people surrounding Israel practiced child sacrifice to a deity called Molech. Moloch. It seems to have different spellings sometimes. They would literally place their living children into the fiery arms of an idol. It's almost unimaginable to us today when we think about that. But is it really? Let me step back a little bit and explain this for you all, especially those who may not be familiar with the Bible and what's in the Bible. So, we learned back in Sunday school when we were much younger that the children of Israel was in bondage in Egypt. They were in bondage in slavery. And while they were in bondage, they were delivered by God, and he placed them in the wilderness. And when they were in the wilderness, they had to really learn about who God is and what his expectation was. And one of the ways that they were to learn who God is and how to serve him was through the laws and commandments that he had in place. And so this would have been new to the Israelites, because they spent what we read as a total of 430 years in Egypt. So Egypt became their life. So what is our Egypt today? So let's look at it this way. Egypt symbolizes, I would say, several important concepts beyond just being a physical place. So when we think of Egypt today, we think of another place. But in the Bible, it's symbolic of many things. And I wrote a few things down here as I was going through scripture and to try to make that connection to Egypt and how we can apply that to our lives today. Egypt symbolized bondage and slavery. Remember, Egypt represents captivity and oppression. Remember, as the Israelites were enslaved there for generations. And you will find that this is the primary symbolic meaning of Egypt. It is a place that you're in bondage, you're in slavery. It also represents worldliness. It symbolizes a place where, I'm going to say, idolatry for the purpose of this episode. Idolatrous practices that God warns the I can't even talk this morning, sorry. God warned the Israelites to not take part of the practices of not only Egypt, but to the land that he was bringing them to. It also symbolizes our desire for material wealth. You know, Egypt was very advanced and prosperous, but it also rejected the true God. So Egypt could also represents like that worldly knowledge and power, but without spiritual understanding or backing. And for those who are also disciples, it represents our old life before we got into covenant. So Egypt would represent the prior existence and what we often call when I was in the world. And it would explain that time before we entered into covenant, a covenant relationship with our Father, the one true God. So it would symbolize the life and practices that we were in, that we were called to leave behind. Egypt is also a system of false security. So, you know, in Egypt, you rely on certain things like the Nile River and human achievements. And so, therefore, it represents the fact that we were dependent on things other than God. So, those are some of the things that I've written down that I felt represents Egypt. To put it in a short way, Egypt represents that life we lived prior to coming to the knowledge of the truth of who God is, and prior to us saying that we are going to live our lives for God. And when we say we're going to live our lives for God, we know that there are certain things that we must put down, but more importantly, we must put God first. And by putting God first, that means that the Bible is our standard, and we're going to live our lives according to the Word of God and what it says. We may not always get it perfectly, but we don't make it a point to try to be imperfect. We don't make it a point to try to go against exactly what the Word of God says. And so with that, to give you some of the background to what Egypt may symbolize, I hope you all, while you're sitting there listening, you're looking to see what Egypt rather symbolizes for you. And so we're talking about sacrificing our children. One of the things that God told the children of Israel, right, when they were in the wilderness, preparing them for the promised land, he told them about sacrificing their children. But what I thought was, I'm always looking at why something is placed in the Bible in the place that it is. And so again, when I was preparing for this lesson, I was reading Leviticus, because that's the first place where this deity, this demon god Molech is mentioned. And he's mentioned both in Leviticus chapter 18, that is, and Leviticus chapter 20. And if you read Leviticus chapter 18, you will see that it's talking about sexual boundaries, and how God is specifically forbidding the Israelites from sacrificing their children to Molech. But it's right in the middle of the boundaries God is placing around sexual relations. And then right down in the middle of chapter 18, towards the end, rather, I should say, he then speaks about sacrificing the children to Molech. I don't believe this is a coincidence. I think this text connects sexual behavior outside of God's boundaries with the sacrifice of children. And so this prohibition appears in a chapter that's focused on sexual boundaries, what the Bible calls uncovering the nakedness. Now, how am I tying that back to Adam and Eve? Is that they covered their nakedness. And here, God is speaking about uncovering nakedness. That phrase isn't just about seeing someone naked. It's a euphemism. It means sexual relations. God established clear boundaries around sexuality. And again, right in the middle of these instructions, he warns against child sacrifice. So here he's talking about sex, and then he's talking about child sacrifice. So when I had my abortion, I didn't see it as a sacrifice. I saw it as a solution to a problem. I was young. I was in an okay relationship, or what I felt was an okay relationship for that age. I had thoughts about what I wanted to do with my career. I also had some financial concerns because I was in school. I didn't have a job. And I told myself that this was just a decision that had to be made. I never thought of it like a human growing inside of me. But one of the things I've come to understand was when we sacrifice children for some of the very same reasons that the people in the Bible began to sacrifice their children: for convenience, for prosperity, for freedom from responsibility, and for maintaining our way of life. And so in the beginning, I asked, do you have any idols? And I'm sure some of you would have said no. But this is when the idol of self comes in. Because I was selfish when I had my abortion. I made an idol of myself. I didn't think about there was a human being growing inside of me. So the people of the Bible sacrificed to Molech, believing it would bring them prosperity or take away some kind of disaster. And today, we sacrifice to different gods. The gods of convenience, career advancement, financial security, or relationship stability. And the concept hasn't really changed that dramatically. Or maybe I could say it did change because we're not actually giving ourselves to a demon god. Or are we? But this demon god, this picture of Molech, if you were to look it up, it has like a head of a bull in the body of like a human almost, and it has his hands outstretched as if it's trying to receive something. And in those hands is where the baby was placed. And in the middle, right where the tummy was, is like a fiery pit. And they would make it so hot that, of course, once you place your baby in the hands of Molech, they immediately began to burn. And part of the ritual was that as soon as they placed the baby in the arms of this idol, of course the baby would begin to scream. But to drown out the screaming, they would begin to play drums so that the parent wouldn't hear their child screaming. And so for those that have had abortion or considered abortion, what are we drowning out? What screams are we drowning out in order for us to make the decision to have an abortion? Yes, I empathize. I understand. I can truly say I understand what it feels like to be faced with an unplanned pregnancy, to be faced with the uncertainty, the fear, the concerns. What will people say? I was faced with all of that. But what screams did I drown out while I'm just thinking about myself? And so, again, we spoke about Egypt, and we spoke about how Egypt symbolizes more than just the place that the Israelites were enslaved. We talked about Egypt representing an entire worldview that we, as God's people, we were called to leave it behind. And so in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 3, God says, "You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live. You must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you." So Egypt represents a society built on false gods. It represents a society that has disordered desires. We put our desires before God. And as such, we have misplaced priorities. It represents a culture that had rejected the true God and established its own moral framework. Does that sound familiar at all? Our society has largely abandoned biblical sexual ethics. We've embraced a view that sexual expression without boundaries equals freedom. But this freedom has consequences. Millions, and I do mean millions, of unintended pregnancies that end in abortion. When I shared my abortion story last week and a little bit today, I mentioned how my choice came after a series of other choices that rejected God's boundaries for sexuality. Remember, I mentioned how I became sexually promiscuous and at a young age. So that abortion wasn't the beginning of my sin. It was just the consequences of previous decisions. So when I found out that I was pregnant, I felt trapped. I remember sitting in that waiting room, talking to myself, telling myself that this was my right to do. I remember my boyfriend sitting next to me. Yes, he was very supportive for me, even though he didn't want me to have the abortion. But I said what we hear numerous people say today, a number of women say today: it's my body, it's my choice, and no one could tell me what to do. But deep down, I knew what I was about to do. What I couldn't articulate then, but I certainly understand now, is that I was sacrificing my child on the altar of self. The higher power I was serving wasn't Molech, but it was just as demanding. It was my own desires, my own plans, my own life as I wanted it to be. So let me talk about something fundamental here: the sanctity of human life. This concept isn't just a religious talking point. It is how we should view every person. The sanctity of human life means that every human life has inherent and measurable value simply because it's human. This value isn't earned by ability or circumstance or the developmental stage or usefulness to others. No. It is something that every human being deserves. And it exists from the moment of conception until natural death. I'm sorry, I don't pre-plan my episodes, and I don't know if you could tell, but I am a little emotional right now because I don't know how one could not be emotional when they're talking about such a subject. So please forgive me if you've recognized that I've slowed down a bit and I'm sniffling. I do apologize for that. So this principle of the sanctity of human life, it emerges directly from biblical truth that all humans were created in God's image. Genesis 1:27 tells us that God created mankind in his own image. Therefore, this gives every human being a unique status in creation that demands profound respect and protection. When we embrace the sanctity of human life, we recognize that no human should be sacrificed for the benefit of another, especially not the most vulnerable thing among us. See, this is what I mean when I say abortion is modern child sacrifice. Not because the motivations are identical, because the underlying reality is the same. We end the life of a child for the benefit of ourselves. The language has changed. We talk about reproductive rights and choice rather than sacrifice to God's. but the outcome hasn't changed. In both cases, whether you were talking about child sacrifice or whether you were talking about abortion today, either way, in both cases, a child dies so that the adult can live the way that they wish. And just like in ancient times, we built elaborate systems to normalize this practice. We've created rituals and language and justifications that mask what's really happening. The priests of ancient child sacrifice assured parents their actions were noble and necessary. And that is something that I am just guessing, because how can any parent take their child and put it in the burning fires of Molech? So I'm sure there was someone there telling them that they're doing the right thing. And that's the same thing with today's abortion providers. They offer similar assurances with just using different terminology. One of the questions we need to ask, though, is who is being sacrificed and for what reason? Sorry, forgive me. So, now I know some of you are thinking, but what about the women in crisis? What about rape and incest? What about health risks? Again, these situations deserve our deepest compassion and support. But even in these difficult cases, we're still talking about ending one human life to benefit another. The motivation may be more understandable and the consequences a bit more sympathetic, but the underlying reality remains. And so when I had my abortion, no one forced me to do it. No one threatened me. I made what I believe was a rational choice based on my circumstances and my worldview at that time. And that's precisely my point. Our worldview determines what we consider an acceptable sacrifice. No, we don't call it human sacrificing today. But that's exactly what it is. We're sacrificing the ability for this child to grow and to have a life. We're sacrificing it for whatever reason we're doing so. Everyone's reason may be different. So in ancient times, in ancient Israel, God called his people to be radically different from the nations around them. He established boundaries around sexuality that protected the vulnerable and preserved family integrity. He explicitly forbidden child sacrifice as an abomination. He called it an abomination. So today, God still causes people to live differently, to uphold the sanctity of human life, of all human life, and to maintain those sexual boundaries that protect rather than exploit. And he also wanted us to create communities where both women and children can flourish. So I know this is pretty much a shorter episode than normal. But next week, we're going to move forward in history to look at Margaret Sanger and the eugenics movement. Another chapter in this ongoing story of devaluing certain human lives. And then the week after that, we're going to explore Maude. Maude was a TV show from the 70s. And there is a 2-part series of this episode called Maude's Dilemma. And it's examining the famous episode that normalized abortion in American culture. So before I go, I do want to speak directly to anyone listening who has had an abortion or may have participated in one. God's grace is bigger than our worst mistakes. I know because I've experienced it. There is forgiveness, there's healing, and there's restoration available. If you're struggling with guilt or with grief, please reach out to me at Shattering the Silent Podcast at outlook.com. And we can discuss the steps you need to take for healing. Please reach out again. Shattering the Silence Podcast at outlook.com. Thank you for joining me on this journey of shattering the silence around difficult truths. Until next time, this is Monica, reminding you that every life has purpose and every story deserves to be told. Thanks again.